Let us take two statements. The first one reads as, the fundamental building block of this nature is uncaused, it's eternal, it's because of that particle this whole world exists. And the second statement is, the fundamental building block of this nature is indivisible, absolutely small, and cannot be diminished any further. These are two different statements made by two different individuals about an atom, which is indeed the fundamental building block of this nature and cosmos. But these statements were made couple of thousands of years ago. Now let us see who made these statements. So it's Maharishi Kanada, an Indian philosopher and scientist, was tentatively placed at 600 BCE. He could be much older than that. And towards the right is Democritus, a Greek philosopher during the 4th century BCE. And now let's talk about the mindset. Our mindset, the mindset of people of India. Now before getting to the mindset of the general public or the majority of them, let's briefly talk about two extremely polarized mindsets. Take these two guys, the one on the left and the one on the right. And both of these guys are watching this video right now. Now the guy on the left says that this channel is a political party's ID cell and spits some kind of Sangi pseudoscience and shit, whatnot. So that's one mindset, the guy towards the left. And the guy towards the right is even more funny. Yes, Indians had 5G and fiber internet during Mahabharata times. Now these mindsets are of politically or religiously motivated, half-educated intellectuals. Now, a significant portion of people are biased this way, but not the majority definitely. A vast majority of us have no problem in believing what Democritus said, but it is hard for us to believe what Maharishi Kanada said. Give it a deep thought and you'll get to know what I mean. We are all susceptible to bias. Being biased is not a problem. But these guys on this extreme left and extreme right, their biases are absolutely baseless and completely motivated only by the political climate or the religious climate in which they have been living. Now the reason I'm saying this one is, atomic theory in ancient India sounds pretty much like internet during Mahabharata times. Absolutely ridiculous, but it is not. And this video is a short attempt to bring forward the facts about the atomic theory, the foundations of it, that originated in India a couple of thousands of years ago. Now let's get to the topic. Vaiseshika Darsanam. Of the many ancient scriptures of Bharat, Vaiseshika Darsanam is a very less known ancient scripture on one of the schools of thought of Indian philosophy. Now this book is our main topic in this documentary on atomic theory in ancient India. And let's break this documentary into three parts. The first chapter will see the background and context in which this book was written. And in second chapter, let's quickly go through the contents of this book. And in the third chapter, we'll see the scientific concepts that are explained in Vaiseshika Darsanam by Maharishi Kanada. Starting with the first chapter, understanding the background and context of Vaiseshika Darsanam. Before we get to that, it's quite important to understand the ancient Indian thought about life. Mana eva manushyanam karanam bandhamokshayoho bandhaya vishayasaktam muktam nirvishayam smrutam. The second verse of Amrita Bindu Upanishad. It translates to, the human mind is the cause of bondage and mind is also the cause of liberation. Mind absorbed in sense objects is the cause of bondage and mind detached from the sense objects is the cause of liberation. In simple words, it says that you are responsible for be it the pain or pleasure that happens in your life. You alone are responsible for both the pain and pleasure. And the ultimate objective of any human being, as per Indian philosophy, is a liberation from both pain and pleasure. This is quite important to understand and you'll get to know why I brought this up. If you are in the field of humanities, you definitely know this. But if you're a science student, there is less chance that you might know the schools of Indian philosophy. So let's take a quick look. We all know the difference between knowledge and wisdom, right? Transposing your knowledge into wisdom, in this process, there is something called as an ideology, something that you believe in. Now, philosophy is something that's built on an ideology in transposing the knowledge into wisdom. And when we're talking of knowledge in India, we all know that the Vedas are the corpus knowledge system since thousands of years. So with Vedas as the central point, there are a lot of ideologies or philosophies that got developed in ancient India since thousands of years. And now let's see what they are. Broadly, the primary school of thought is Astika, which takes Vedas as the primary source of knowledge. And then we have another school of thought called as Nastika, which does not take Vedas as the primary source of knowledge, but has its own independent philosophies. And further down, in Astika school of thought, there is a subdivision which is atheistic in nature. This sounds absolutely crazy, but it is. And the atheistic schools of thought are Samkhya, Nyaya, and Vaiseshika. And we are talking about Vaiseshika, but let's park that for a second. And then we have theistic schools of thought further down in Astika, which are Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. Don't worry about the names, we'll see what they are in a short while. Now, the fundamental difference between atheistic ideologies in Astika and the theistic ones are that they both take Vedas as the same platform or the basis for their ideologies. But the atheistic philosophies of Sankhya, Nyaya, and Vaiseshika does not take God as the central reference or does not bring in the concept of God while they're explaining their philosophies. It is a more rational and realistic approach of understanding what is in Vedas and transposing that into wisdom. While theistic philosophies of Yoga, Vedanta, and Mimamsa, they completely take Vedas as the baseline, and on top of it, they completely rely on the Supreme Being, God, as the central reference point in developing those ideologies. And when I first learned these facts, I was really speechless. Broadly, when we talk of Hinduism in modern day terminologies, it is generally understood as a religion. But how come you have atheistic philosophies blended into a religion? I mean, the English word religion does not fit to Hinduism. First of all, I don't know what exactly is Hinduism because there is nothing like Hinduism in first place. And that is the reason it is called as Sanatana Dharma, which means an ancient philosophy about life. Now, calling Hinduism as a way of life, I don't believe that statement is also right because every religion is a way of life. Every religion gives certain good values and morals and ethics and whatnot, all the guidelines to lead a better life. So every religion is a way of life. But having an atheistic ideologies blended in the same philosophy of a religion, I mean, this is a crazy combination. I don't know what we need to call this as, but let's simply call it as Sanatana Dharma. Anyways, let's move on to the Nastika school of thought. Here we have three clans again: Buddhism, Jainism, and Charvaka. So broadly, this entire ecosystem of ideologies, these are what the foundation pillars of knowledge and wisdom in India since many millennia. Now, each of these schools of thought have their own scriptures, gurus, ideologies, etc. And we are talking about Vaiseshika. And probably this is the reason why India organically evolved as a pluralistic society. Don't call secularism, that's totally in a different connotation in today's world, you know that. But let's call it as a pluralistic society. Anyways, let's move on. We are focusing on Vaiseshika's school of thought. To understand the Vaiseshika, we need to also understand Astika, which is one level above, in a little more detail. Now let's quickly see what is Astika school of philosophies. Be it the Vedas or holistically Sanatana Dharma in its entirety, is a moral compass for humanity to pursue four important virtues. They are Dharma, which means responsibilities, Artha, which is wealth, Kamya, which means desires, and Moksha is the ultimate liberation. Dharma, Artha, Kamya, Moksha. These four virtues are also called as Chaturvida Purusharthas. And be it any philosophy that you take under the Astika category, there are 6 different paths to pursue these 4 virtues. To keep things simple, I will just talk only about Vaiseshika school of thought, and the rest 5 maybe in some other time we will see in more detail. So this Vaiseshika is a school of experience. It's an atheistic philosophy, like I said, and it does not bring in the concept of God while explaining its ideology. But what exactly is its ideology? Here it is. Vaiseshika fundamentally believes that this whole world, the nature, cosmos, you, me, everything in it, is fundamentally built on a building block that is an atom. And that atom is eternal, and it takes different forms and shapes to manifest itself into either a human being or an animal or a mountain or a river or fire. Everything and anything in this nature and cosmos is a manifestation of atoms in different forms and shapes, and one has to experience it for himself or herself to understand the true form of this nature. It broadly talks about eternity, and while explaining the concept of eternity using atoms, it teaches about how a person he or she need to pursue these four virtues of dharma, artha, kamya and moksha. Now in this school of thought, Vaiseshika, which was founded by Maharishi Kanada, this is probably the world's oldest written record about the atomic theory. For last 8 to 9 minutes, I am going only into the introduction part for one very important reason. The foundation of why we are talking about atomic theory needs to be very clear, because it's not that something just fall out of the blue sky. There is such a deep context and background associated with the atomic theory. And now let's see what Maharishi Kanada says. And that brings us to the second chapter of this documentary about Vaiseshika Sutras, or what exactly Maharishi Kanada wrote as part of his Vaiseshika Sutras. So before we get to the Vaiseshika Sutras, understanding sutras is very important. I made a separate documentary only on sutra, and if you're interested, I'll leave the link in the description below. See, a sutra is a ciphered or an aphoristic articulation. It's a technique in Sanskritam where the deepest of the meanings can be written in shortest forms. I'm not sure if any other language has it, but definitely it is one of the most important traits of Sanskritam, that you can write and rather condense huge meanings into very short format. And Vaiseshika Sutras are written in that format. Do check the documentary for a better understanding, but for now, let's move on. Talking about Vaiseshika Sutras, there are 373 Vaiseshika Sutras or principles that are articulated in 10 chapters, and each principle is just one line, but the meaning associated with it is so deep. And this entire 373 principles is hardly a small handbook that explains about the entire Vaiseshika Sutras. Now let's see what's the content of each of these chapters quickly. The first chapter has 48 sutras, and here is what Maharishi talks about. Dravya, the types of elements, earth, water, fire, air, etc. And he particularly defines fire, water, earth and air as atomic substances that always exist for eternity and takes manifestations in different other forms and shapes eventually. And then guna, properties of these elements, karma, types of actions, generality, specificity, the cause and effect. So all these topics are discussed in the first chapter. And in the second chapter, which has 67 sutras, the properties of dravya or the elements of nature is even more detailed, and the sensory perception abilities of mankind about how we touch, feel, see, smell and hear things is detailed out. This is very important to understand here, how man comes in contact with nature. That's what actually Maharishi is laying a foundation for. And then he talks about Nitya, which is eternity, and Anitya, which is transient, the cause and effect scenarios when we come in contact with the nature. And then he continues talking about space, time and mind. These three subjects are detailed at great length in Vaiseshika Sutras. The concept of space, time and mind. And in the third chapter, which has 41 principles, Maharishi explains about how inquisitively we need to explore the nature, learning through experimentation and proof. It's as simple as questioning, why does a waterfall flow downwards? Why does the dry leaves of a tree fly in the direction of a wind? A critical analysis of cause and effect. And these sound very fundamental, but why these topics are discussed is eventually to bring in that sense of introspection to understand the Atma or the self. And that's what is discussed in chapter 3. And in the fourth chapter, it has 25 principles. And here is where Maharishi Kanada starts talking about Satya, the ultimate truth, and extends the concept of Nitya. And here is the first time when he brings in the concept of atom to explain the Nitya, that which is eternal. He brings in the concept of atom, which is called as Anu in Sanskritam, and eventually explains about the concept of atom, magnitude of the elements, the earth, fire, water and air, and how atoms manifest into these four fundamental substances, and then talks about living things on this earth, Yonija and Ayonija, two classifications based on how a living thing takes its birth, and so on. Then comes chapter 5, which has 44 principles and one of the most interesting chapters. Here is where Maharishi talks about the detailed illustration of karma, the actions, the physical actions and here is where he talks about the gravitational force, the concept, the laws of motion in nature, and how the self comes in contact with actions, and also talks about adrishta, which is invisible forces in nature. I made a detailed documentary on the gravitational force and laws of motion as explained by Vaiseshika. I will leave the link in the description below should you wish to watch. And coming to chapter 6, which has 33 sutras, here the impact of adrishta on mankind, the concept of dana, donation, and the concept of pratigraha, receiving, the merits and demerits of the karma, all these subjects are explained. As I said, the ultimate objective of this school of philosophy and the remaining 5 of the Astika schools of thoughts is finally to guide mankind on 4 virtues: dharma, ardha, kamya, and moksha. And that is the reason why we are having these concepts of donating and receiving also explained as part of the Vaiseshika Sutras. This is a bit difficult for us, people who are educated in last maybe 50-60 years or last 100 plus years, because our subjects are very different. We have science and then we have humanities as 2 different subjects. But what's interesting with Vaiseshika Sutras or this philosophy is it blends in both these concepts of science and humanities together to define the purpose of life. And this chapter is a good example for that thought process. Let's move on. Then comes the 7th chapter with 53 sutras, and here is where Maharshi further details about the structure of the atom and how the 2 properties anutva, which is the atomicity, and mahatva, which is the magnitude, are possessed by the elements of nature like fire, earth, water, air, and so on. And this is the place where he also explains in more detail about akasha, which is space, kala, time, and atma, self, in conjunction with the concept of the atom. And in the 8th chapter, the concept of cognition and self-experience, the different types of jnana, how to obtain knowledge from the nature through sensory perception of the basic elements of it. It has 17 principles explaining this process. Then comes chapter 9 with 17 principles. This is a very interesting chapter, something that is very difficult to even think of. Maharshi talks about the concept of non-existence. So for instance, if there is a glass of water that is half filled, we always look at the water that is filled half of the glass, but we can never think of the remaining portion of the glass which is empty. What could have been in that, or why is it empty? So that thought process, or the concept of thinking about something that never existed, it's a very hard task. And that concept of non-existence is explained by Maharshi Kanada in this chapter. And then he continues with the truth versus perception of a myth, the concept of anumana, how you should be doubtfully introspecting yourselves or exploring the nature with an experimental mind. And also he explains about avidya, which is ignorance. So all these important topics which are really hard for us to even think of, these subjects are explained in this chapter. And finally the last chapter with 16 principles. All this process of explaining the atom, its eternity, the elements of nature, sensory perceptions, etc., everything boils down to understanding 2 important entities: sukha, which is a pleasure, and dukkha, which is a pain, and how they are both transient in nature, a critical analysis of their causes, and realizing through your own self-experience to discover the purpose of our own lives. That is the ultimate objective of Vaiseshika Sutras, and the concept of atomic theory is a vehicle to explain the ultimate goal of life. And that's what is the Vaiseshika Sutras, and that is why the atomic theory was developed in ancient India thousands of years ago. Now let us have the outlook of Vaiseshika Sutras to understand certain concepts a bit more technically. Now according to Maharshi Kanada, the whole universe is categorized into 6 padarthas, and they are dravya, substance, guna, attributes, karma, action, samanya, generality, visesha, specificity, and samavaya, which is inherence. So these are just categories, and we'll see what they are in a short while. And our focus is particularly on dravya, which are further classified as 9 different substances, and guna, the attributes, as 17 different attributes, and karma as 5 different actions. Let's zoom into these. The first one is dravya or substance, 9 of them, with which the nature and this cosmos is made of. And here are they: Prithvi, earth; Apas, water; Tejas, fire; Vayu, air; Akasha, space; Kala, time; Dik, direction; Atma, self; and Manas, mind. Now these are the elements of nature. Now, how we perceive them are called as gunas, and here are they: rupa, color; rasa, taste; gandha, odor; sparsha, touch; samkhya, number; parimana, dimension; samyoga, conjunction; vibhaga, disjunction; prithaktava, distinctiveness; paratava, priority; aparatava, non-priority; buddhi, intellect; sukha, pleasure; dukkha, pain; Ichcha, desire; dvesha, aversion; and prayatna, willpower. Now, these are different attributes either of a self or of the elements of the nature, but these are the parameters basically. And the third one is karma. When we come in contact with the nature or the nature within itself, karma or an action is a continuous process, and there are 5 types of actions as defined by Maharshi Kanada. And here are they: Utshepana, upward movement; Avakshepana, downward movement; Akunchana, contraction; Prasarana, expansion; and Gamana, movement. Now these 3, dravya, guna and karma, all these attributes and karma and elements of nature, it is a continuous orchestration of all these things, and that is what Vaiseshika Sutras are explaining in different combinations, in different scenarios, what happens, how it happens, etc. I think now it's a lot simpler for us to understand. Getting this view is very important, and you'll get to know in a short while why so. Now let's see the scientific concepts that are explained as part of the Vaiseshika Sutras. Now if we take a look back at the same view that we saw just now, while explaining dravya or the substance, this is where Maharshi detailed out the atomic theory, and while explaining about the karma, and this is where he detailed about the gravitational force and the laws of motion. These are 2 important scientific concepts that are part of the Vaiseshika Sutras. Now coming to the gravitational force, I already made a separate documentary only on gravity and the laws of motion as defined by Maharshi Kanada. I will leave the links in the description below. And just for a simple touch and go, here are a couple of sutras on gravitational force as given by Maharshi Kanada. Samyoga abhave gurutvat patanam. The translation is: on disjunction, an object falls down due to its own mass. Mass here is gurutva, and I've already mentioned in the previous documentary how etymologically gurutva, which is a Sanskrit word, is connected with the Latin word gravis, from which the gravitational force, what we use, or the gravity word, is originated. And another such sutra is Gurutva Prayatna Samyoganam Utshepana. An upward throw of an object is a resultant of an upward thrust and the downward gravitational pull. Like this, there are many laws of motion explained by Maharshi Kanada. For now, let's move on. So that's gravitational force. I'm going to skip that in this documentary and just focus on atomic theory. And let's flip over certain important sutras in this context. Prudivyapas tejo vayurakasam kalo digatma mana iti dravyani. This sutra explains the dravyas or the elements of nature. One interesting thing is, we generally know that earth, air, fire, water, space, these are the elements of nature. But interestingly, time, atma, self, and manas, mind, these 3 are also constituents of this nature. That's what Maharshi says. I mean, it's a very interesting perspective. Think about it. And this is another important sutra where the definition of atom is explained. Sadakarana vanityam tasya karyam lingam. The translation is: the fundamental existence of this nature is uncaused. There is no cause as such for the existence. It's eternal, and the atom is the proof of this argument. And this sutra is what I presented in the beginning of this documentary as opposed to the Democritus view about an atom. Well, it's not about who is right, both are right. Maharshi says that the existence of the atom has no cause as such. Well, Democritus' view is the atom is the fundamental building block, the most discrete version of it, and it cannot be further divided. Both are right with respect to atom. But yes, this is what the definition of atom as given by Maharshi Kanada. And then Maharshi explains about the structure of atom, Nityam Parimandalam. It translates to that which is eternal, which is atom or the anu, is Parimandalam, which means spherical. The shape of an atom is spherical. Well, this is a theory. Let's not forget that it's an atomic theory. I think the vocabulary explains for itself. Nonetheless, thousands of years ago, even thinking of something called as an atom That itself is an unbelievable thing in itself. So let's move on. And here is another sutra that talks about the eternity of the atom. Anor mahatascho paladhyayanupalabdhi nitye vyakhyayate. And that translates to the atomicity is found in eternity. Its magnitude reflects in the perception of the atom. So basically what it means is that which is eternal is always atomic in nature. Here it doesn't really talk only about the atom, but the atomicity. Say for instance water, it can exist on its own, and that is a discrete part of the nature. The discreteness, that atomicity, is what here it's being talked about. And the concept of atom can be perceived in the magnitude of that specific entity. That's what this sutra says. Like this, there are many sutras that talks about different concepts of the atom, the elements of nature, gravitational pull, ethics, morals and values, a lot more. But what is the bottom line of Vaiseshika Sutras? This is very interesting. Let's see. At the end of the Vaiseshika Sutras, at the very last, this is what Maharshi says. Drishtanam drishta prayojananam drishtabhave prayogabhyudayaye. And this is the translation. The path to prosperity is led by prayoga, which means experiments, which can be seen and experienced by oneself. Maharshi says that one has to experiment and experience everything in nature to understand its true form and as well understand the true purpose of our lives. And he finally says that Tad vachanadamna yasya pramanamiti. Thus the Vedas stand as a proof of whatever that I said. And Maharshi concludes this book. Here two things are very evident. Number one, possibly that Vedas also hold certain atomic theory related concepts, going by what he wrote in the very last lines of the Vaiseshika Sutras. But what's even more important is the sutra which is above, leading a life through experimentation and experience. That is the core essence of the Vaiseshika philosophy, which is very relevant and very important for the youth of this country and the youth of the world as well. We have to continuously explore, experiment, and then try to find new things, new experiences, build new solutions for the new problems. That explorative mindset, that's what Vaiseshika Sutras teach. While it is the oldest record in the world about the atomic theory, what's more important is the message that it is giving. Unfortunately, these kinds of scriptures, the hidden details in the great Indian knowledge system, are not being leveraged. And this is not just a loss for only the Indian community, but for the people across the world. Hopefully one day, just like how the world is embracing yoga, let's hope that Vaiseshika Sutras or Vaiseshika philosophy sees the light of the day. And as always, thanks for watching.